Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I'm happy that I'm not here by myself. I was a little bit afraid of that at 1 o'clock on Saturday, right after lunch, and people getting out of here, we might have a small group, but apparently I can't really see out there because we've got these bright lights on, but there, I think, are people out there from the clapping. So thank you very much for being here today. Hopefully I'm going to be able to give you some information that you're going to be able to use. This is a great privilege for me to be asked to speak at the NSCA because the NSCA has always been a great resource for me, especially as a young coach. I remember coming to the early conferences and trying to learn as much as I possibly could and writing and everything. It's amazing how things have changed. I started coming to NSCA conferences in the early 1990s. I'll be honest with you, I haven't been the last few years. We get a little bit overwhelmed in the NFL and don't have time to get out and do some things, but it was always great. And I look at now that, I remember writing notes and trying to get everybody's slides down. And obviously there wasn't a lot of PowerPoint and that stuff at the time, but getting it down. And then I came in the other day and I get a book that's like that big. You have to be a strength conditioning professional just to carry it around, right? So that's great, and I did my part in there. I've got a lot of slides, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I do these type of talks. I try to give you as much information in those slides as I can, so that you can look at that stuff and go through it. So you don't have to worry about writing down all that jargon and all those little things. And then what I'm going to try to do is give you an overview. So it's really two different things. You have the slides, so you really don't have to go to the talk if you just want to look at the slides. But if you come to the talk, you get to hear some other stuff. I don't want to also insult you by just reading off the slides. So it's going to be a combination of both. So hopefully you'll get some things out of it. But we'll start off. Obviously, there's my information. We're talking about designing programs with the idea of injury management. In the National Football League, and probably in professional sports in general, the main focus for us has to become injury management, and I'll tell you why. You look at the time that we have with our players. The majority of my time that I have, that I can legally through the CBA be with my players, is in season. It's preseason, it's in season. Our off-season program now, thanks to the new CBA, is a total of 9 weeks long, and in those 9 weeks, one of those weeks is a mini camp. And in a mini camp, it's 3 days long. You have two two-a-days and a one-a-day. Anybody that's dealt with football before, good luck trying to get a lot of quality training during two-a-days. So that's 1 week that's gone. The other 3 weeks are what are called OTAs, which are kind of the equivalent. Now, we're not in pads, but are kind of the equivalent to spring ball. So again, it's more of an in-season type mentality. So if I'm lucky, I get 5 weeks to be able to train people. Now, on top of that, 3 of the weeks, the coaches can start doing stuff with the players. So they may do some walkthroughs and they may do some different things, and you have different things. And we have our quarterbacks, which, by the way, yesterday was a pretty good day for us. Pretty nice day to get the guy, $100 million, and that's all it took, but we got it done. But our quarterbacks will do some throwing and stuff with their position groups, and pretty soon that takes away from some of your agility and stuff. So basically your off-season performance enhancement program gets taken away, and we get into season, and we're just trying to hold on to it and keep it going. And also we're dealing with elite athletes that have gotten to a level, and we can not worry too much about it. Basically, give you an idea of my prime directives, things that I try to do, this is things I believe in. I don't want to get pigeonholed into one philosophy or one modality or one set way of doing things, and part of it is because I have an advantage because I think I came up on my own. I didn't have the advantage of being an assistant for someone, so I didn't learn directly from somebody. I had to learn from a lot of different people, and so it formed this kind of open mentality that I have to training. Now, there's some things that I do that I think are very, very important, but we change things up. I'm going to use anything I possibly can to help our players reach their goals. I look at the weight room, I look at the strength and conditioning program as a laboratory. And what we want in that laboratory is we have people come in, and I think this carries over whatever your profession is. If you're a personal trainer, if you're whatever you're doing, we have people and they come in and they present problems. The problem might be I'm not fast enough. Usually that's not going to be good because I'm not going to have enough time to get it done and they're going to get cut. But that could be a problem. The problem could be I have a history of hamstring issues. The problem could be I don't change direction very well. The problem could be any number of things. And so I need to utilize the tools that I have at hand in that laboratory to try to solve that problem. And that's one of the things that makes my job awesome, because I get to have a lot of fun that way. And I also want to constantly learn and evaluate. I learned some things a few minutes before I came in here. And one of the frustrating things about doing a talk like this is you have to turn in your presentation so soon, and you put stuff in. I was like, wait a second. If I turn something in a couple months ahead of time, I've changed my mind a bunch of times by that time. So I'm going to have to, go off the script a little bit sometimes today to deal with that. So we're trying to get better. We've got objectives. Obviously, we're identifying and eliminate weaknesses. We tell our players all the time, there are a lot of exit doors in professional football. You get in the building because of your strengths, what you do well. We evaluated that. We saw that. We like it. You're going to leave the building, all of us, coaches, players alike, are going to leave the building because of our weaknesses. And so we have to be able to be man enough, or woman enough, obviously, if you're dealing in college like I used to be, or some of the other areas, to deal with the fact that I have weaknesses and I have to deal with it. And professional athletes don't like to hear about anything they're not good at. They don't want to deal with it. If they're not good at it, they want to avoid it. And so the hardest challenge of my job is to try to make sure that we identify and then do things to eliminate those weaknesses in our performance. We want to enhance performance, obviously, because it's a big money game, and the better we play, the more likely we are to win. We have to manage injuries, and that goes back to that first thing. Okay, so many injuries, I believe, have acute onset with a chronic mechanism. Okay, some weakness along the way, some compensation pattern that was developed ended up in an injury. How does a guy run down the football field without any contact at all and blow out his ACL? What happened there? Was it the field, his special shoes? Who knows? I tend to believe there's probably something along the way in his hips, his ankles, something along the way that made him develop some weakness, some instability that eventually showed up in a chronic or in a catastrophic failure. And we also, to a lesser degree now that I'm in the NFL, but obviously when I was in college it was a huge deal, the mental aspect of training is part of what a strength coach always has to worry about doing. Now, one thing that I like to talk about, the difference between what athletic conditioning is, what athletic strength and conditioning is. We're going to adapt techniques from different disciplines for the purpose of developing the characteristics. And this is a big thing for me, because I think one of the mistakes that we make, and I'm going to touch on it a little bit later, is that we tend to take things and apply them. We fall in love, as coaches, we fall in love with drills. We fall in love with exercises. We pigeonhole ourselves into, I'm this. This is what I believe in. This solves all my problems. But the reality of it is we need to take a lot of different ideas and find that toolbox and figure out what tool is going to help us. Versus attempting to improve athletic performance by turning athletes into something that they're not. I listened to Joe Ken, one of my colleagues, yesterday, and he talked about how strength and conditioning, weightlifting, conditioning, whatever it is we're doing, our jobs is secondary to the players we're dealing with. They're playing their sport. That's what they're worried about. And so trying to develop them into a power lifter or an Olympic weightlifter and working on some of the techniques. Obviously, you have to work on techniques for the different exercises you're doing to make sure they're doing it safely and effectively. But if we just turn it into a competition, not very good. Or if we get crazy on some of the functional stuff and we turn them into like these circus performers and we're so unstable that it's like impossible to do, that can be a problem too. Or we're just bodybuilders, or we're just whatever. We need to use tools from all of those different realms, but figure out how it fits in the program. Now, this is kind of an interesting way to put things, right? How strength coaches, personal trainers, sports medical professionals screw up athletes. Sorry to use that word if someone's offended by that, but it's better than the word that I probably would have used in my realm. Okay? We have a little stronger language, sometimes used in the NFL. You guys probably heard the Greg Williams talk, but anyways. One of the things we do is we're too rigid. I talked about this. We overrely specific concepts. We let ourselves just say, this is the answer. I've been searching for the answer in strength and conditioning my entire career. This is my 26th year in coaching. And I have things that, actually this is weird, but it keeps me up at night wondering about certain things, about how I can improve performance, how I can help this person not get injured, and all these different things. And we start to, I get frustrated when I hear, I wish I was as smart now as I thought I was when I was younger. It was a lot easier back then, when I thought I had answers. Now it's like an onion. I've peeled it enough that I realize there's just more and more layers. And the more I peel it, the more questions I have. And eventually I will become so completely confused that they'll have to wheel me right out of here. And I'll just be babbling somewhere. But I'll keep working on it. The one thing, a quote that I always use, if the only tool that you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And I think we tend to do that in strength and conditioning. We have this great technique that we use, we have this great assessment that we use, and we're going to apply everything to that. Everything is a fact of that. Everything's caused by that. If we could just deal with this, and we've heard it, I've been in it long enough to hear that. You have these fads that come through. Well, this is the answer to everything. There is no answer to everything. There's the answer. Everything works for a period of time, and nothing works forever. You just have to make sure you're asking the right questions and trying to get the right goals. Inappropriate training stimulus, and I see this, and I was a big problem with me when I was younger as a strength and conditioning coach. I got caught up in this whole concept of getting worried about whether or not a guy could bench press, can squat, can clean. We're setting these records, and the first NSCA event that I spoke at in Dallas, late 1990s, I was so proud. I had 30-some guys that could clean 300 pounds, and I had 30-some people that could bench press 400 pounds, and I had all these 500-pound squatters, and I had all this stuff. And that would have been awesome if I was training a team to clean, bench press, and squat. But I wasn't. And so sometimes we get that. And what does that lead to? That leads to a concept that we'll talk about later of compensations that develop. OCD in respect to specificity of training. I think that's a problem that we run into, and I think there's a lot of that. We're probably going that pendulum swinging away a little bit more, but I think so many times we talk about, hey, it's got to be specific, it's got to be specific, it's got to be specific. Well, here's the problem. Did I mess something up? Okay. I broke it already, sorry guys. Do we factor in the actual performance of the sport? If I'm an offensive lineman and I'm hitting guys all the time, I'm doing all these strike drills, and then I would say to work on strike in the weight room, I'm going to do a bunch of medicine ball explosions. That's cool, but I better factor in the total volume, because when they went through practice, they did all these repetitions, right? And you wonder how you get overuse injuries, because we do the exact same things in the weight room that we're doing in practice already, and we're not counting that volume. And any great researcher that you talk to, any great coach will tell you have to look at the total volume, because that's how your overuse injuries happen. That's how your compensations happen, and that's how your imbalances are created, because the body becomes its function. And I think, unfortunately, in many cases, athletes would be better off if they did nothing than if they followed some of the ideas that we sometimes get caught up in. We have to have a plan. Now, I said that, but you have to have a plan. Terry Hepner was a great coach that I worked for. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago, but too young. But he would always talk about having a plan, work the plan, and plan for the unexpected. And that has affected me in coaching all the time. I have an idea of what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try to implement that plan, but I'm constantly willing to go off the script, because sometimes things change. Sometimes we have a really tough game and we have to change our end season. Sometimes I see our players and they're too beat up, they can't handle what I plan to do. Or other times, like, wow, these guys are pretty antsy, they're ready to go. I can kick it up. I've actually had times flying home from a game when I watch our players on the plane, and it's unfortunate everybody can't spend one time flying home on a 767 with a professional football team and see some of the antics that go on, especially after you win a game on board. So the cutting up that guys are doing and different things. But you see they're all revved up, they're ready to go. And I think, you know what, I think I can rev it up a little bit more tomorrow. I can go with plan B a little bit with our off-season or our in-season training program than what I could. And there's other times like, these guys are dead, I better back off. And we can't let our ego get in the way of success, ever. That's especially true for me in the NFL because I find out right away it isn't about me. When I was a college strength coach, I was up there. You know, I had some control over things. Now, the players are the most important thing. That's why they make the money that they make. And it goes on down to there. And somewhere deep, deep, deep down away is the strength coach. We'll talk about the body becomes its function. When faced with any kind of demand, the body will adapt to it. So we must make sure as strength and conditioning coaches that we're asking a body to adapt to what we want to become. What do we want it to become? If we ask a person to do a certain exercise, they're going to get good at it if we focus on it enough. If we ask them to do a certain technique, they're going to get good at it, and they're going to find a way to get it done. But sometimes, maybe we need to make sure we're asking the right things. Unfortunately, that results in compensation. I talk about that, rather than efficient movement. Injuries over a lifetime, those are things that can affect you too. I deal with that all the time. I deal with the sins of a lifetime of being an athlete at my level, by the time they get to my level. You know, and you say, how do we contribute to that? Well, you know, there's the guy that always got his ankles taped, and you take a joint that should be very mobile and it becomes very immobile. What problems does that cause? We get hurt and we get in a boot, and how does that change their gait? And if you have people that have been in a boot quite a bit, how does that affect what kind of compensations are developed from that? We have a person who has a shoulder injury and they learn how to move a little bit differently, or hip injury or whatever. And so these injuries are something that we have to look at all the time as well. Joint stabilization, performance, injury prevention. I have to tell you a quick little explanation here. In 2009, my approach changes all the time, but in 2009, our kicker at the time, John Carney, introduced me to a gentleman who's sitting right up here, Dr. Joe Lacoste, who's my co-author for the book, who really blew my mind with a lot of different ideas of how joints should be stabilized, and how the body works, and how the body functions, and different movers and stabilizers and things like that. And that just led me on a path that I'm on right now of how I design programs and the different things. And it's quite different than what I had done before in the past. Quite different than what I did before in the past. And you can look through some of the things. But the basic thing is, if you have unstable joints, you know, you're going to have some problems. And if you have immobile joints, you're going to have problems. And if you have muscles that are long because of joint relationship, like a pelvic tilt, hamstrings, you're going to have injuries. And if you have muscles that become short, you're going to have some injuries as well. And I think that starts off that chronic path of leading to the injuries with their acute onset. So what we look at in our program is constantly, and you've heard this concept before, I think we approach it a little bit differently, but constantly trying to get the body back to balance, because everything we do as an athlete takes us away from that center of balance, that center of normal, how the body should normally run. And you can walk around this exhibit hall, this building, and you can see what a lifetime has done to certain individuals as they walk around here. You can see the guys that were the big, like me, the big bench pressers, and we always walk with our hands facing backwards because we inwardly rotate our shoulders. And a lifetime of that has led us to the point where we can't comfortably lift our arms above our heads. And you see people who walk. I used to always watch hockey players, and they would walk like this. Body becomes its function. A lifetime of doing something leads to a strange development. We can see that. So we got to balance it back out. We spend a lot of time trying to balance it back out. In fact, that's the majority of what I'm doing in season now. Traditional exercise categories. This is how I used to look at things. It's no different than what we do, and you can call them different things. I listed it there, you know, core exercises, assistance exercises, all this different stuff. This was a template that I used for a large part of my career. Different paradigm now. Assessment. I'm not going to go into specific assessments. Okay, there's a lot of different ways to assess, but to assessment, to me, I can have experts come in and assess and look at the body and give me ideas of some of the problems that are being there. But the biggest thing that I do, first of all, I look obviously at injury history, because that's going to give me some information. There's some trends that develop there. There's also some potential problems because I know what they did to solve that injury. And in the NFL, everybody's injured all the time. They just play through it most of the time. If you're completely, people say, oh, well, we're injured. Well, the only injuries we really count are the ones we miss time on, but everybody's hurting all the time. It's like getting in a car accident, literally, and then you got a week to get better before you get in your next planned car accident. And you do that 17, 20, 18, 19, 20 weeks in a row, and you can guess what happens. So we look at our sport, we look at our position they play, we know there's going to be certain issues with that, the injury history there, and individual structure. However you want to assess it, whether you do it through a movement part or just looking at structure, looking at posture, looking at all those kind of things, but we have to look that up, and we have to put that together, and then that'll give us our direction. And then we move into looking at balance, attainment, and activation. We find out what we can do to pull that body back into balance. What can I do to get those shoulders coming back so I'm not rotating forward? Because now my shoulders hurt all the time because they naturally form like this. But when I do this, I look weird a little bit, but it feels a lot better. Now, how can I do this to make this natural for me? How can I wake up inhibited muscles? How can I correct compensation patterns, develop appropriate movement patterns, teach people how to move again? How can I lengthen short muscles and strengthen and shorten some of the muscles that are overly long? And also I need to work on skill enhancement and integration. And this is something that came to my mind. I have a 3.5-year-old son who has he has a classic speech impediment in that he substitutes the wrong things, like he says tooties instead of cookies. His sister's name, instead of Kylie, it's Yayi for a while. He changes it all the time. I don't know what he's calling her now, but his problem, I would go to a speech pathology with him, and the speech pathologist would talk about how we need to integrate Danny. Danny can say all the sounds. He can put it all together. He knows what it is, but when he starts talking, he loses it. Same thing with athletes. We need to learn how to fire our glutes, and so we do glute activation exercises in the weight room, and we do some stuff. We do hip bridges, and we do all this stuff, and then we watch them not do that when they go on the field. We teach speed improvement. We teach running form. It looks great when they're doing running form, and then we watch them on the field, and they don't run like that. How can we get the training into the performance? Because that's what we're supposed to do. Doesn't matter if they look good when they're with you. It matters if they look good for us on Sundays. So we have to put these things together and get them to work. So we're looking at assessment. Looking at posture, looking at the right line, where people should be. I'm not going to read through all this kind of stuff, but you can look at that kind of stuff. And we look at that and we see, is their head too far forward? Are they too far back? Anterior pelvic tilt. Are they like me and have short right leg syndrome? So one leg seems a little shorter than the other, and it causes problems. So eventually I'm going to probably have some hip issues, or I have some issues. I'm probably going to have some things done because I've got one leg that's just kind of seems shorter than the other because of some issues there. So we go through that whole deal, and we see potentially what some problems could be. And then I love the joint-oriented approach. I love this whole concept that's out there with talking about what joints need to be really primarily mobile and what needs to be stable, and what happens when you stabilize or artificially stabilize or a joint that should be mobile, and what happens to the joint that should be stable. For instance, how do I blow out my knee? Because I've got this ankle that doesn't want to do all the movement that it should do, and so all that force goes on the knee. Human body is a structure. It's no different than any building you build. Sometimes you have a building and it's unstable. You don't know it. You look at it, it looks good. But what happens is once you add force to that building, boom, it falls down. Why did that happen? And that, to me, explains a lot about how did this player that had the great offseason, is in awesome shape. He's passed all my tests. He looks phenomenal. I can't wait for him to get going. It's great. I love him. I'm pumping him up. I'm giving him T-shirts. I'm putting his picture on the wall. I've got all these records for him. And the first day of practice, he's hurt and he's out. What happened? Well, he got strong enough to hurt himself. He wasn't strong enough to hurt himself yet. So sometimes that can happen, and we have to make sure we have those joints working the right way. Important parts of movements. We have large stabilizers, we have movers, and we have small stabilizers or rotators. Okay, this is a concept that Dr. Joe has taught me, and I think it means a lot. And some of the problems that you run into is when movers become stabilizers. Easy identification for me, Stabilizers are muscles that if they weren't functioning, if they tore, you wouldn't be able to stand up. Okay? I tear a quad, I'm going to fall down. I pull a hamstring, I have a hard time running, so or locomoting. So my hamstrings are movers. Good example. And then the small stabilizers, muscles that work in rotator, that affect rotation, not only in generating rotation, but resisting rotation. Basic type of muscles, here's a graphic showing how those work. It's a crossover type of graphic, a pattern of stabilization muscles and patterns of mover muscles. And you look at that, and that makes sense. The one thing that kind of throws off a little bit is the chest. That somehow threw me off as well, but that's just basically how that works out. Dr. Joe will explain to me sometime more about that. But you look at this. Large stabilizers tend to be short, calves, quads, low back, upper chest. Movers tend to be long. The shin, a really important muscle, tibialis. Hamstrings, gluteus, abdominals, upper back. So it goes back and forth. And the question I would ask you, what gets trained in the gym the most? By the average person. Guys always change. Everybody wants to do bench press all the time, all of my players. They want to bench press. Any guy always wants to bench press. And guys, you know, people like to work on their quads, and they'll do some hamstring work, but probably not as effectively as they could. But that's what ends up happening there. So I have a list of compensations there, the different problems that exist. Okay, and I want to move on so that we can talk about what we do to solve some of these, or try to solve some of these issues. But I want you to understand that that little part there at the bottom of the red, which can cause a lot of issues for us. And understand that if you take anything from that slide, look at that. Talk about pelvic tilt posture. And look what a person looks like when they're in pelvic tilt. We went through a period of time where we had a number of athletes who were diagnosed with a sports hernia. And that was a big thing. We had a period of time, and generally across the NFL, where you start to see players with torn Achilles tendons. It's strange how these injuries kind of come through. Achilles tendons really freaks me out because Achilles tendon injury rupture is supposed to be a guy like me who decides to go out and try to play tennis, which would be stupid, by the way, because I don't play any games that involve hitting a ball with a stick, because I'm not very good at it. That's the whole idea of a weakness that we try to avoid, but I'm old enough I can avoid my weaknesses. I don't have to do it, so I don't do it. But anyways, we go through these different things, and the guy plays tennis and he tears his Achilles. Well, with a sports hernia and a hamstring pull, you look at pelvic tilt, and it kind of shows you why. If that pelvic tilt, that pelvis is put forward, look at the abs, look at what happens to them. The hip flexors get shortened up, quads are short, the adductors get weak, all these different things happen, so we have that problem. So if we can attempt to make one change in our players, it's to try to get their pelvis tilted correctly, or at least teach them how to do it. Looking at core versus core. Everybody thinks about core, we think about our torso, and I'm going to think about core also as being a core of a joint. And a core of, every joint has a core. When they looked at the earlier slides, you could see that. We had some stuff there. But we're looking at how stabilization occurs. We're looking at how the joints work together and all that, and stability. Basically, the takeaway from this slide, again, is that almost all injuries happen in rotation with the ability to rotate. And until recently, I thought of rotation the way a lot of people think of rotation. We thought about, well, rotator cuff, so we look at our shoulder, and we thought about rotation in the torso. You know, I'm doing some side twists and things like that, and maybe even some explosive stuff. And that was the only thing I think about rotation. But just think about what happens. What do you say when someone injures a knee? What do they do? They twisted it. I twisted it and it just gave out. I turned my ankle. I rolled my ankle. I tweak this, I tweak that. It's all in rotation and the body's ability to handle rotation. Well, if we're not training rotation or the ability to resist rotation, we're losing out on something we can do in performance enhancement and injury prevention. Because the body, especially when we're adding all that force with all the other strengthening that we're doing and the other speed development that we're doing, we add all that to the structure, and now that stability is not possible. So we have to look at how we can do that. And so we try to train some things in rotation. There's some certain things that we can do, some certain exercises that we've utilized that allow us to be able to do that, and it also solves some of the structural issues. Again, it talks about the different, I've got some information about how we different move, and we think about the different planes of motion more so now than I've done in the past. And this is all how I start putting together scripts and menus of exercises that I want to use, and what will that exercise do for me? How can I add that to my tool chest to allow me to be able to solve a problem? What exercise do I do? What drill do I do that can solve this problem? The takeaway again from this one, most postural and injury problems begin around the hip, ankles, and shoulders. Think about that, it's a big deal. And you think about the hip can cause problems in the low back, hip can cause problems in the knee. Sometimes the injury might come up from the ankles or the feet and go up the kinetic chain that way. You might have problems in the shoulder, problems in a thoracic spine that's not working correctly. It gets to be a shoulder problem. Sometimes we try to stabilize things around because the body, again, will fix itself. It'll find a way to protect itself all the time. And sometimes that way of protecting itself doesn't enhance performance, but also puts us ready for another injury to happen. Looking about planes of movement. Hip and shoulder joints are rotating when they move in any direction. I never thought about this, but it makes a lot of sense. External rotation, we pretty much get that. With shoulder stability programs, we do a lot of different external rotation stuff. We don't really work on internal rotation unless we have some specific problems, but external rotation. The hip joint, pretty similar, okay? A lot of rotation that can happen around that. And so the difference between the hip joint and the shoulder joint is the shoulder joint, you got this large amount of musculature, this large stabilizing musculature in the front, and so we have to strengthen everything going away from that. The difference with the hip is now all this large muscle mass is in the back, and so we tend to become externally rotated, we tend to become anterior pelvic tilt, and different things that we do, and so our internal rotators need to be strengthened, and we need to find ways to strengthen those to balance that back out. And this is just a look at the hip rotators. Again, looking at the external and outward rotation muscles. Looking at the outer core, inner core, because again, some of the work that we found out in doing some of the Rotex work is the actual inner core muscles are involved in some of the hip stabilization as well. The internal rotators, or the internal obliques, become very active, and there's imbalance between the external obliques and internal obliques that can cause a number of issues. And you also look at these muscles as being kind of the least targeted, right? There's some data coming in now talking about concussions with the neck and the lack of neck strengthening. I know when I was a young athlete, we did a lot of neck work all the time, and I don't know that we necessarily do neck work. And I'm sure there'll probably be some research that, it always, as always, it always bounces back out. That yeah, we need to work on the neck. No, we don't work on the neck. But I know one thing: if you have a problem, it's like Joe Ken said yesterday, get stronger. Getting stronger is probably not a bad thing, especially if it's specifically designed, it's specifically applied. Talk about these different things. I'm going to move through here so we can get into some of the exercises. Here's the problem, again, the takeaway from a lot of this wording here. If muscles that are primarily intended for powerful movement are trained to assist or assume the role of stabilizers, compensation patterns begin to emerge. Because the hip rotators aren't stabilizing the hips, the hamstrings start being active in stabilization of the hips. The glutes aren't firing, different things happen, and you discover it's like the thing when you do the hip bridge, and you find out somebody does a hip bridge and their hamstring starts to fatigue. It's because their hamstrings becomes a primary mover in certain things. There's muscles start taking over for other muscles they don't want to take over for, and you're setting yourself up for compensation patterns and injuries, to some overuse injuries because of that. Getting into core rotation. We use the machine that's listed here. We've also tried to do some other exercises, but we're talking about how we can train against a heavy resistance in rotation. And the machine that the Rotex machine, we utilize in our program quite a bit, and we utilize it as a warm-up. We utilize it as part of our supersets that we do, and I'll show you a little bit of that later. Unfortunately, my videos are not working. I've got some separate. If we have enough time, I'm going to pull it off. But some of the exercises that we do, first of all, the Rotex stuff, if you're interested in looking at it, there's a site, rotex-strength.com, that has all this stuff on there. And you can see the videos, and you can pick the stuff up probably on YouTube and everything too, to see some of these different internal rotations. But the basic work that we do is we do some different protocols. Those are listed on there, how we're trying to do that. The explanation of the exercise is also listed, so you can pick that up. It's unfortunate, my man Charles Bird, my assistant, was going to get his chance in the sun here, but you can just see a little bit of him now, his picture. But internal rotation for the hip. We do a pulse. We also, besides the holds, we do a heavy internally rotated exercise against a heavy resistance. It's more of a dynamic movement. We move to that once we superset a lot of that stuff with regular exercises. Double exercise, I've got that I can show real quick if we have some time here at the end, but we're going to rapidly not. So we have that. Calf stretches, different exercise we do. Ankle rotations, an exercise that we do. All these are listed. Looking at some of our categorizations, posterior chain work, to give you an idea of how we design programs specifically. One thing that I've got to do is I now try to hit our movers that we need to get stronger with a lot of strengthening exercises, and some of our, for instance, like the quad, like we're working the hamstrings, we're doing a lot of posterior chain work. There's different exercises we do. I love to do single leg work, and I'm going to talk about some specific single leg stuff that some things that we've done to ramp that up a little bit. But different exercises we do there, and then our quad work, we do work with a lot of flexibility. We do some stretching and some different things during our workouts trying to get that done. We may pair that up. So we look at supersets. Supersets may not just be strengthening exercises. It might be an exercise, a stretch supersetted with a strengthening exercise for an opposing thing. Unbalanced load is something that I'd like you to play around with. I picked this up, I think, on the internet. But just basically, you're taking 10 to 15% at the most of the weight and adding it more to one side than the other. And if I'm doing an RDL, I would have the unbalanced side away from the support leg. And if you try it, you'll find out you get an entirely different feel. And the problem we have with NFL players is we really, especially in season, we don't want to load them with excessively high weights because there's a risk of injury. And obviously, if I want to keep my job, I need to make sure that guys aren't getting hurt in the weight room. So sometimes I can flat load some of the strengthening stuff, but just by progressively making the exercises more difficult or more challenging, or forcing them to incorporate more stabilization with that. It might be going to an unstable surface on some things. It might be going to different ways, unstable load that way. I've got some cool ideas that I picked up at this conference of some things we can do with that unstable load as well. We also use some bands. Here's another way to load the single leg RDL. We'll take a band, attach it to a rack behind us, and we walk out, and we have that band around the hip joint. So basically, as we come out, it distracts the hip. And then we perform the exercise normal, and we could also get really crazy and perform it with an unstable load as well. But you go through there, and it's just a completely different feel. And so if we had a basic RDL, and then that got fairly easy, and then we went to unstable load, and that changed us a little bit more, and then we go to a band or a combination of that. That changes us a little bit more. What I tell our players all the time, especially in our off-season program, if you come in the next day and you tell me you're sore in ways that you've never been sore before, the program's working. So guys will come in the next day, like, yeah, great. Thanks a lot. The program's really working. You know, so stuff's not working, but that's just telling me what they need to work on. So we got that. Band leg curl is a great way to do that. We attach it through there, and we do basically 3 different steps to that. We do a back, kind of a hip extension exercise, single leg, and then we go into a bent leg, and then we go into a rotating, kind of a cycling through with that, with the band attached there, and you can kind of see that in the picture. But it talks through that. That's one of the great ways besides glute ham raises. I love those and all that, but that's a cool way to do some leg curl stuff, and it's kind of specific. Our speed kicks is a way we can superset. Basically what I do here is, and it would be nice to show you, is we just take a ball, we take a stability ball, and we'll set it right on the back of his hamstrings around his glutes. He lays there, and we go for time, and then they're just going to kick that ball as fast as they can. It's a ballistic exercise, training the hamstrings, and that's something I picked up with some people who talked about guys that have hamstring issues, and when we do these fast kicks and fast movements with the hamstrings, you never pull your hamstring jogging, so you do it in speed. So somehow that has an effect. It's worked out well for us. Knee dominant exercises, that's some of the different things we do. We always have a large number of exercises that we follow. And we always target those knee dominant with a lot of active reactive stretching. We do, you can see it here, standing quad. Guys will come in, you'll see them, we have some training tables set up, and they'll come up and they'll just put a foot up on the back of this bench, and then they'll set up and they'll do a quad. It's explained in the slides, but basically what we're trying to do is go into an anterior pelvic tilt, which is creating the stretch in the quad, or in the quad that you're trying to stretch, and we're trying to lengthen that muscle in between. We might do that with, like, we're doing sets of posterior chain work, and then we're stretching the quads at the same time. We've got that. Lying quad stretch is just a partner exercise that we can set up there. Just different combo exercises, forward combo, backward lunge as well, that we put together. I really like to show this one, but this is basically, we have progressions and lunges that we do, progressions and step-ups that we do. And we try to make it, again, to integrate it more into what we're actually doing, make it see like doing a walking lunge traveling is great if you can do it in your facility. Sometimes it's hard to do. So what we'll just do is do a regular lunge, and then we'll step forward, and we have a step back kind of thing. So you're working different legs, and it's just training that whole idea of how the body really works, is going one leg then the other. Because when we just do one and then come back and do the other and come back, that's a little bit, that movement pattern isn't similar to what we're doing on the field. So that's something that, again, affects the stabilization. The body has to adapt to that movement, and we think it carries over onto the field pretty well. Single leg deadlift, unbalanced load. First of all, single leg deadlifts are awesome. I used to do a lot of like the single leg squats with the rear foot elevated, but I tended to see that my players were really anterior, putting that pelvis too far forward. They were getting a lot of stretch, and I thought that might be aggravating some of the issues that we have. Plus, they're cheating because they're pushing with the other leg. If you stand up and you get a barbell and you try to go down and stand back up, you know, you get a little bit of a counterbalance with that weight. You can't do it without a weight, but you do it with a weight. All of a sudden, that stability that they use there is great, and once they get good at that, then we'll throw an unbalanced load on that, and that'll really rock them a little bit. Torso, just talking about what we've got to is a concept of movement prevention more so than generating movement. We're trying to tolerate, and we're trying to maintain a lot of stability with planking and different external ways of trying to get the body to resist that, because for an athlete, basically that torso has to resist movement more so than move. If you're moving all over the place, it's not necessarily good. And if you're generating a lot of movement, you're going to probably create some imbalances as well. Upper body pulls, we try to do a ton of upper body pulls because our players always want to do upper body pushes. So we're going to go, and any of these pulls to pushes, or when we're trying to balance it out, we might set up a program where we're going in terms of total volume intensity, 2 or 3 to 1 when we're programming exercises. And sometimes, we'll remember also, if you have a significant problem and you've got an imbalance and it's like this, and you're trying to strengthen this, if you keep strengthening this one, you're never going to get it out of imbalance. So sometimes we have to back off almost entirely and not work on something to get it back into the balance ratio that we want, and that solves the problem, then we can move forward from there. So there'll be times of the year that we'll take and we won't do any of the primary exercises that we do, and we'll balance it back out with some different stuff. We talk about pushes are all there. Sample workouts, you can see a little bit about what we did. That's circa 1993, basic workout. And this is a template similar to what we do now. One thing real quick before I get pulled off here, I want to explain. We go to a lot of trisets in what we do. And when we set up a triset, I will utilize some of the techniques that I have where, let's say that I'm going to use the Rotex or use whatever it is. I know we're not supposed to do any product stuff here. So whatever you're doing for internal rotation on the hips, you do an exercise to activate the internal rotators, and then you might pair that up with a squat. So you get the hips going, then you do the squat, and then we might decide, well, what's our issue? Do we have more of an issue with the hamstrings being weak and causing problems for us, or do we have a problem with lack of mobility or short heel cords and things like that? So we need to lengthen those out. So our third exercise would be put in to deal with that. So we might do some kind of a stretching exercise. We have some other things that we can do in rotation that works on that as well. But we go through those exercises, and it's great for keeping guys going because a lot of my job is to keep guys moving. But it also solves a lot of problems. They start feeling, you get integration in your training because now you see how it's supposed to feel, and now I'm doing an actual exercise and I know what that exercise is, and now my performance improves as I go through it. I can maybe flat load for a period of time or go up in weight, different things on that primary exercise. So we do a lot of balancing out. We also might do, if we say, hey, core stability is a big issue for us. So we're going to do a lot of core stability stuff before we do a lift or as part of our lift. Obviously, we don't want to fatigue the core too much if we're doing Olympic lifts or things like that, but just for a concept of activating and getting us to think about our proper body position, and we put that in all the time, and I have to remind our guys all the time with how we should do things, and this helps us to do that. And there's just some different exercise there. You can see it's a very generic workout that I set up here, but it gives you an idea of what some of the stuff we do. Again, there's some quick hitting on some of the intensity guidelines that we follow, and we use some Prilpin stuff too, but I'm not quite as into some of the pure periodization, again, in the off season because it's so short. All right, before we take questions, this is one of the smartest things I've ever learned. And it came from a 4-year-old boy. And I was sitting and we were watching TV, and I was changing channels, and he kept wanting to watch what he wanted to watch, and I was kind of watching what I wanted to watch, and I looked at him and I said, hey man, it's not all about you. And he told me, he looked up at me innocently and said, it's not all about you either. And I'm like, you know what, you're right. It's not all about me. And it's not about any individual, but the ability for us to be able to work with athletes and to work with populations and help them. If we can do some things to help people, we have a pretty good life. And, so sometimes we just have to step out of it, take our ego out of the whole deal, and realize that keep the main thing is we need to work together. And the end process of someone getting better, there's nothing better than that. There's nothing better than seeing people reach their goals, whatever they is, if it's in athletics, if it's in general life, whatever it is, we try to do that. So thank you very much.